My name is Orfhlaith Campbell and I'm a prohibition and drug reform activist, and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this event tonight and bringing this amazing group of people together with lived experience of the issues caused by the war on drugs. If you follow me on social media, you will know that I am absolutely obsessed with drug reform, and I hold no shame over that. It is my opinion that the modern war on drugs is an oppressive system of criminalisation that has led to the destruction of my generation, the ceasefire gen. When I think of my generation, so many of them are gone. And while these are not my stories to tell, these are the stories that drive my activism every single day. The amazing thing about anyone's child is that it puts a face, a personal story, love and compassion at the centre of a conversation that is usually taken over by fear, bias and misinformation. Aside from my research background in prohibition in Ireland, my personal story is quite simple. I lived in a country for a number of years where cannabis was legal, and during a very hard time in my own life, I was able to consume both recreationally and medicinally, and I was able to heal. Moving back home to Ireland in 2019 was a shock to the system, and the stigmatisation of cannabis users meant that I was stepping back into a 1980s style war on drugs. If I went to get my substance of choice that I had used medicinally and recreationally for 3 years, that I had bought at the vending machine at the shop at the end of the road, I would be a criminal here who would be looking at a monetary penalty and jail time. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense because our drug laws are not based on medical and scientific evidence at all, and it is based on race and class-based discrimination, and that is now hid behind the fear of intoxication. As the amazing Carl Hart recently said in McCanny's Decriminalisation in Ireland webinar, poor people in Northern Ireland are getting their asses kicked by drug policy. The war on drugs is used to justify the large numbers of police in Northern Ireland post-Good Friday Agreement. In 2020, 70% of stop and searches carried out with the PSNI were under the Misuse of Drugs Act. The majority of these were on males between 18 and 25. As Niamh Eastwood of Release Drugs has stated in the past, these high numbers show that stop and search is not about finding guns or knives, but it's about the police going out and actively looking for people who are in possession of small amounts of drugs, mainly cannabis. Post-Good Friday Agreement, drugs were situated as the threat which would give the sides a common foe and a way to come together. You can actually see this happening again here in Northern Ireland over the last few weeks, as the drug arrests and seizures are stepped up to try to make society feel safe. Such a coincidence that today we have got Northern Ireland's biggest drug seizure ever. As our panellists will explain, it's all smoke and mirrors. Drugs were scapegoated for the horrors coming from our conflict, and this has affected the mental health of the working class young people throughout Northern Ireland. Police bias is a very real issue here, but it is not the exact way that is being rolled out by the current narrative, and I really hope tonight's event will go a long way to changing the conversation and encouraging the PSNI to become involved in this conversation, as other police forces in Britain and Ireland already are. The PSNI are the outliers in this conversation. Today in 2021, there is a direct correlation between drug-related deaths in deprived areas in Northern Ireland. This follows global trends highlighted by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime that states 90% of drug users will mature out of problematic use, while 10% may become addicted. Within the 10%, substance use is coming from mental health and or trauma, and not the other way around, although it is accepted that substance use can escalate mental health issues, and this is where things start to get complex. We have a culture here that accepts alcohol as okay, but the use of any other drug equals misuse, and we have a treatment and recovery programme that is largely focused on total abstinence. This is compounded by the largely accepted and hypocritical just say no ideology, which keeps the toxic fear of intoxication of drugs, all drugs except alcohol, going round and round. And this hides the groundbreaking harm reduction work that is carried out in Northern Ireland by activists and services such as those that Chris Rental is going to chat to us about later. The use equals misuse mindset here is reductive in its driving stigma, and stigma was highlighted by Professor Siobhan O'Neill last year as a significant barrier in overcoming suicide issues in Northern Ireland. 191 people died in 2019 from drug-related deaths, and the majority of these deaths were young men between 25 and 34. These are not druggies or junkies. These are our families and friends and neighbours who are dying, and these deaths are avoidable if we are brave enough to implement a system that will bring about the change we need. Use does not equal misuse, and until we eradicate the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, we will not be able to keep young people safe, especially as the spread of county lines continues to become more apparent in Northern Ireland. Anyway, tonight is not for me to rant, but to facilitate the knowledge on the panel to advance this conversation to help our communities and families in Northern Ireland get the support that they need. We have an election coming up early in 2022, and we need to hold every single politician that comes knocking on our door account on the wall of silence around the drugs that is currently blocking the evidence-based reforms that are proven to work. I'm going to ask our panellists now to introduce themselves, then we'll move on to their talks, and then that'll be followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers. While our speakers are telling us their stories and lived experience, I'll be watching your questions come through, so any questions at all, feel free to send them in. I'm just going to go around the screen as you guys are all there, and Gian, I'll just start with you if you just want to introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, thanks Orla. My name's Jane Slater. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive Officer at Transform Drug Policy Foundation and the Campaign Manager of Anyone's Child Families for Safer Drug Control.
Thanks, Gian. Penny?
Hello, my name's Penny McCanny, and my son Aidan died in 2013 of an accidental overdose of heroin, and I am a member of Anyone's Child, just telling his story.
Thanks, Penny. Peter?
Hi, my name is Peter Krykant, and I am an independent MSP candidate for Falkirk East, and I operate Scotland and the UK's only current overdose prevention facility in Glasgow.
Thanks, Peter. Neil?
Hi, I'm Neil Woods. I'm representing the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, the growing international movement of police who are calling for drug policy reform.
Thanks. And finally, Chris.
Hi, my name's Chris Rantoul. I work for Extern, and we provide a number of different types of services for people with drug and alcohol difficulties.
Thanks, guys. We'll just move on now then to the speakers, and the first up is Penny, if you don't mind.
Okay, as I said, Aidan is my son, my oldest son. That's his picture just above me. He was my first child, and when he was 25, he died of an accidental overdose of heroin. I think the point of Anyone's Child is to put a face to people who use illegal drugs, because people have this notion in their head what everybody is like, which allows them to disassociate themselves. So that person who is homeless can be an illegal drug user. Someone like Aidan, who went to Queen's and has a degree in chemistry, studied his master's in London, is also an illegal drug user. So what I'm going to do is put a face to Aidan so that you can connect. When I say that Aidan was brilliant, everybody says their child is brilliant. Aidan literally was brilliant. He had a degree in chemistry. He could talk about anything, any subject, you know, Russian literature, science, obviously, anything at all. He was a giant of a guy. He was well over 6 foot tall. His nickname was BFG, Big Friendly Giant. Massive. He would hug you and you just felt so loved, so secure. When he was young, I mean, he was never further than this away from me. Start crying, I haven't even started. He was never further than that away from me. As he approached his early teens, 14 or 15, I knew that he took a drink. What, by the way, he sees as the most serious of all drugs, because he felt very much that was the one that opened, it was the gateway basically to other drugs, the one that he found the most difficulty in controlling. I didn't really understand. I thought we were talking about cannabis when people talk about drugs. I didn't understand how available it is. I did feel, does Aidan have mental health problems? I didn't know. And I'm a nurse, by the way, you know. So our relationship during that time became fraught. There was always this secret, this elephant in the room. What was it? And I say although we were still very close, and in fact, my daughter says the reason Aidan pushed you away was because he didn't want to have to talk, you know, about what he found difficult. As time went on, it became very apparent there was something, and to shorten the story, In April of 2013, we found a drawn up syringe of heroin, and although I had never seen it, I knew exactly what it was. Called Aidan up, and when people say that your life drains away from you, that is exactly whenever I saw that vial or that syringe of heroin. And I said, and remember, Aidan was a giant of a guy, a giant. And I said, what is this? And he said, it's heroin, Mum. And he took off his jacket, and he always wore a jacket. And I thought it was because he was a big guy and he was covering up, and there were the tracks for the heroin. He'd been taking it for a number of years. Nobody except one friend, a friend that he took it with, knew that he took heroin, and he had friends who took other drugs, because in his mind heroin was a step too far and people didn't talk about it. And even other people who use illegal drugs sometimes have an attitude about people who use heroin. So from the 22nd of April 2013 until the 27th of July, in many ways, our relationship repaired itself, because the elephant in the room was gone. He could be honest. He wanted to come off heroin because he didn't want to be addicted. He also didn't want to go into methadone, because your life becomes very tight then. And also too, he didn't want to replace an addiction with another addiction. He wanted to be free from that. He wanted to see life on the other side of heroin. So because there's such a stigma associated with it, what he did was basically cut down his dose. He took heroin somewhere, our house, where if he collapsed, he could be resuscitated. And during that time, as I say, that's what I learnt, what brought me to Anyone's Child. I remember when he was cutting down his dose, and I said, first of all, by the way, I always say this is a bag of heroin. I literally believed a bag of heroin was something like that. And I said, like, why does that look like, that looks like a bigger dose? And he said, no, Mum, you don't understand. 500 milligrams of paracetamol is always 500 milligrams of paracetamol. That little bag of heroin could be any strength. And that was the first penny drop moment, as I say. It never struck me. I wasn't regulated. So he brought down his dose as he went on, and that is so difficult. And though those times were fraught, to say we had honesty, it's the first time I linked, and ridiculous as it sounds, prohibition, i.e. with alcohol. It's exactly the same. That's exactly the same model as we use here. When he talked about recovery, he did say things like about heroin-assisted recovery, you know, which is not available anymore. In other words, the same as giving somebody nicotine to come off cigarettes. You don't give them some random thing to come off it. You give them the very thing that they take. And he also went cognitive behavior therapy too, to be able to talk through maybe what took him to difficult places, because he was an extremely compassionate person. He felt the weight of the world. As I say, I feel like I'm rushing his life here. In June, he basically said, like, I'm done, that's me finished. But we knew there would be lapses. He says, we're ridiculous, we're on such small amounts now, it's pointless. But we knew there would be lapses, and anybody who's smoked knows that, you know. So I and my other two well, Megan was only 16, but children went on holidays. Aidan stayed with his father, my husband. And when we were away, I got a phone call from Paddy, and he said, I'm sorry, Penny, Aidan's dead. And I describe this to people. There you go. My life ended. But I thought, I sat in the room that night as I waited for a plane. And I said, I will not be a dead man walking. I will tell the story that he didn't feel that he could say because of the stigma. And that's why I do what I do. The things that would have saved Aidan's life, less stigma, and I'm talking about me too, by the way, I'm talking about the judgment of a parent. If I had understood a lot earlier, he could have come to me. Heroin-assisted recovery, safe injection facilities. If Peter had have come to you, he would be alive. And regulation of drugs. And those are evidence-based approaches that could save a life of a 25-year-old boy who I wish you all could have known. I feel sad for parents who are not the parents of Aidan. So that's what I'm doing, putting a face to anyone's child, putting a face to people who use illegal drugs.
Thank you so much, Penny. Your bravery in sharing your story and what you're doing for other mums and dads, just really caught up in fear at the minute, and you're guiding the way for them. And I've so many questions for you, and I'll get to them at the end. But just thank you as always for your absolute bravery and being willing to speak with us. You did. You mentioned there about Peter, and if you don't mind, I think we'll maybe just follow up with you now.
Thanks, Penny, and yeah, thanks for inviting me tonight. And that was really, it's really touching to hear you talk about your son in that way, and for you to come forward and have that understanding now, of the interventions that could save so many more children. And that's for me, since I started running the overdose prevention centre in Glasgow, that's probably been the most rewarding part about it. The amount of people that have came forward and said thank you. We've lost a brother or a sister or a child, and I'll just tell this story quickly. There was a woman who used to babysit for me. She was about 15 and I was a baby, and I hadn't seen her for probably since I was a baby, and she obviously seen through social media the work that I was doing, and she lost her son in July 2016 to a heroin overdose. And she contacted me just after the new year, and I met her at her son's graveside, and she showed me the letters that her son had written from prison, begging for help, actually saying in the letters that the prison was the only place that he thought he could get help. And I was and she spent those 4 years, since July 2016 to 2nd of January this year, just constantly blaming herself, just thinking it was her fault, and that for me is some of the most rewarding stuff, because I think there was a bit of sense of relief there when I was able to sit down with her and say that it was bad drug policy that was responsible, nothing else. And so running the overdose prevention service here in Glasgow has been massively rewarding in those respects, and just hoping now that we're going to see some sort of real drug policy reform, and I've took because I believe that at the moment we just don't have the political will in the UK government to change this. We constantly see, like, over the last 10 days or so in Glasgow, it's constant stop and search, like people are getting stopped and searched consistently. I posted a video online yesterday or the day before about police officers stopping and search under a section 23 of the Misuse of Drugs Act, and the guy's homeless and he's got a little bag of clothes, and they search through his bag of clothes, they find a quarter bottle of vodka, half left in a quarter bottle of vodka, and they confiscate it from him. It's like, what is the point? It's just absolutely soul destroying. A young guy, 23 years old, he's a regular, he comes to us all the time. He usually comes 2 or 3 times a day for the 5 or 6 hours that we're out each day now. He's been stopped and searched 5 times in the course of 7 days. And we can't even say, even although we know that targeting drug dealers is a complete waste of time as well, because there's just no point in it. What we need is regulation, decriminalisation to begin with, to move towards regulation, to take it, to really, invite people into treatment, and remove that stigma. But we can't even say that they're targeting dealers. And one officer spoke to me yesterday, after I stopped filming, and he said that the reason that we're stopping and searching these street level drug users is this is where we get our intelligence. We stop them, they'd handcuffed the guy, and we're searching him outside the van. Now, I'll guarantee you, if I wasn't there taking a video and the New York Times weren't there photographing it, he was getting taken to the sells, and that's what the officer actually says. This is where we get our intelligence from the street level drug users to find out where the dealers are. Now, Neil will probably tell me if that's true or not, if there's any truth to it. But if that's the actions that are being taken, there's little hope for change. You know, and that's the reason that I've turned my attention into politics, because, you know, as a former street homeless person who went through a long period of heroin dependency and is now doing this, I believe that politicians do need help to account for the changes that need to be made. And I want to take that right into Holyrood without a political party and say to them, well, with my Adidas tracksuit top on, and say, look, yous are completely and utterly got this wrong. Things need to change, and they need to change now. You know, I recognise that there's difficulties all over the UK, but what we're seeing here in Scotland is absolutely just devastating. You know, like the drug-related harms that I see on a daily basis. You know, it's just mind-boggling. You know, we're talking about people having prosthetic legs, still injecting in their groins. You know, like abscesses, covered in abscesses all around their bodies, you know, unable to even get injections in their groins because their groin abscesses are that bad, and they're just being left out there in those conditions, unfortunately being left to die. So yeah, I think that's probably long enough, isn't it, from me, but just thanks for letting me come on and talk. You know, every time I do something like this, I just feel we're hopefully getting a little bit closer to real change.
Absolutely, Peter, and you're driving that change forward. And you know, we'll talk about historical, you know, revolutionary people, and what you're doing right now is revolutionary, and you're leading the way for change. And as I say, I know I've been saying it to you for months at this point, but I can't wait till the restrictions lift and I can get over and see it with my own eyes. And I said I'd help you canvass at one point too, but if that's still happening, I'm definitely there. But yeah, no, you're keep doing what you're doing. And again, I can't wait to ask you some questions at the end as well. Chris, over to you, if you don't mind.
Surely, and thank you for the invite. Just listening to Penny and Peter there, I was thinking, how the hell do you follow that? But I have a few wee things that I'd kind of like to bring. And I suppose maybe I bring a little bit of a local perspective to things and how it's actually going on here. But I guess, you know, first of all, I should say that some of the views that I may express may differ from that of my employer. So just get that bit out of the way first. And then also just to say that kind of Northern Ireland is a bit of an odd wee place. We're kind of stuck right out in the west of Europe, and we're a little small place with a small population, and we definitely have a strange history. And obviously, without going into the whole bombs and bullets thing, you know, it was a very traumatic and terrible history, and you know, over the last 50 years, and many people lost their lives, and many more were badly injured and wounded psychologically as well as physically. And that actually, I think, has shaped our drug culture more than we probably realize or know. For example, we didn't really have the same level of injecting drug use during those kind of very troubled years, because it was very difficult to get drugs around the place. There were 24-hour checkpoints, there was lots of police, lots of army, all sorts of things around the place. So it was difficult for drugs to become easily available. And there was also certain policies employed by 3- and 4-letter organizations in an attempt to keep drugs out of the communities that they purported to represent and serve and protect as well. But since the Good Friday Agreement, you know, things have changed in most cases for the better, although not for all communities. For those who are the most disadvantaged communities, and they're often the ones that were most affected by the conflict, they still seem to struggle. There seems to be more drug-related deaths in those communities, alcohol-related deaths in those communities, and more other indicators of poverty and deprivation that haven't been ameliorated by the effects of the Good Friday Agreement, which have broadly been very positive for us. I mean, nobody could argue that your grandparents are, you know, we're better off than we are today. I don't think so, not here anyway. But anyway, yeah, I guess part of why we were different is because we were very slow to embrace, what's commonly called harm reduction and harm reduction initiatives. So, for example, in Great Britain, needle exchange was actually implemented during the Thatcher government, so mid-80s. But in Northern Ireland, we didn't have an officially operating needle exchange or needle syringe provision until 2001. So it's 15 odd years later. We also were very late to the table, I guess, around opioid substitution treatment. So the provision of methadone or buprenorphine for people who are opioid dependent and usually heroin users. And that didn't happen until 2006. So it was considerably slower in other places. Now, I think we've kind of caught up a bit. For example, the take-home naloxone scheme for Northern Ireland actually was up and operational in 2013, which was a lot quicker than other parts of the UK, slightly behind Scotland. And if you just have heard from Peter there, the particular scenario in Scotland is very distressing. I was thinking about both Peter and Penny and what they were saying, and over the last 10 years, there've probably been around 2,000 parents that have buried a child because of a fatal drug overdose in Northern Ireland. So 1,000 fathers and 1,000 mothers, presumably. And that's a lot of people, until you realise that in Scotland, nearly 1,200 people died from a drug-related death just in the last year, for which they have the recorded stats. So, we're in trouble here, I believe, or certainly there's signs of it anyway, and there's definite harms, but Scotland just seems to be so much further ahead, and it's so tragic there. Anyway, we have, I hope, kind of shown that we are catching up with some other areas and things that we know might work. I mean, there's a lot of talk around drug consumption facilities, and Peter has mentioned that. I think, we will need a lot of concerted effort and support to be able to get there for one which might be required. In fact, not might, it is required in Belfast City Centre. I see the evidence of that every week and hear of it every day. So there are things that we could still yet do. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about the Misuse of Drugs Act. And what I think is, if you look at it more broadly or look at it across the UK, it's really pretty difficult to see how it's been a success. And I even think that people who are supportive of the Misuse of Drugs Act probably also suspect that at heart as well, that it has not been a success. Now, others, including myself, would see it as a failure and a continuous failure for the longer it is enacted. But if you think about these things like the diversionary schemes and the cautioning schemes and things like that, it's almost like a recognition that, criminalizing people doesn't work. So what we'll do is, instead of getting rid of this legislation, which I think would be well overdue, we'll go down a sort of softer route, but we don't have the courage to turn around and say, no, we realize this is wrong and we shouldn't do it. So that's I suppose what I think the general sort of temperature of the water is with that. And the other thing I think about the Misuse of Drugs Act is the people that support it the most and have most to gain from it and would like to see it enacted forever are the people that make money out of drugs. So you literally make people who are, in some cases, if not in a lot of cases, fairly unsavory and unpleasant people. You make them rich and you make them powerful. And you give them positions within their communities, which they are able to, or some of them are able to use to, tyrannical effect in those communities. And again, where you see the great degree of harm, it's concentrated in those communities which have experienced deprivation and suffering from the conflict here, in particular in the years gone by. But, even if you look outside the UK and you think about the kind of the worldwide war on drugs, I mean, one of the things that I find really disconcerting is the amount of damage that's done, in fact, environmental damage that's done, say, for example, in, cocaine production factories in Colombia and mountainsides and hillsides. And then you think of like Mexico. I don't know the figures, but I know it's in tens of maybe not even tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. They're killed in Mexico simply because it lies between North and South America, and the cocaine and other drugs, you know, or, well, I mean, the cocaine is transported through, I suppose, cannabis, different matter. It is, as far as I understand anyway, cultivated in Mexico. But irrespective of that, you can see the point I'm making. And the last thing about, you know, the sort of broader worldwide side of it, I think, is that it allows for populist leaders like Duterte just to go and do whatever the hell he likes, you know. So it gives some people excuses to do pretty awful things. So at a local level, at a UK and Ireland level, I think it hasn't helped, it hasn't worked at all. And I think at a global level, the war on drugs has been an absolute disaster. So what I sort of would like to see is that when we review the Misuse of Drugs Act, we think about it and wish we had been there 50 years ago to say, what's the worst possible outcomes of employing a policy or a set of legislation such as the Misuse of Drugs Act? And if we were able to see that then, and we had the courage then, we probably wouldn't have enacted it. But it's also a good idea to think about it in reverse, because if we get something better or we move towards something better, we also have to convince the people who think that what is the worst possible outcome of this different set of policies, for example, decriminalisation or regulated supply. Our great hope, I think, in terms of regulated supply is that we've seen very good results in recent decades in how we've controlled tobacco and the way we approach tobacco control in the UK and in some other countries as well. So it may give us kind of the model or the framework that we could utilise and think about regulated supply of drugs more widely than just tobacco products.
Thanks, Chris. That was brilliant. And yeah, just as you were saying there, to look back, I keep thinking of that newspaper clip when I tagged you in yesterday from 1923. It's, you know, it literally could have been spoke about yesterday. It's so it's not even 50 years ago. We need to go back. It's almost 200 at this point. To, you know, we've been just doing the same thing over and over again, and it's just having these conversations to ease people's fear, so we can start getting those systems of decriminalisation in to keep people safe. But Neil, we'll move on to you now, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thanks, Orla. Brilliant speaking as ever, folks, Peter, Penny and Chris. You alluded to this just then, Chris, that one of the problems we have in the drug policy reform world is that the majority of people think that there's some benefit in the current system. And so with an event like this, I suppose my main job really is to try and explain the reality of actually policing drugs in a punitive system. So a few of you probably know of me already, but I'll explain to you that I used to catch drug dealers for a living. That was my full-time job as an undercover police operative. I did that over the space of 13 years. So what I would do is I would move from inner city to inner city around England, and I would embed myself in the street community, the vulnerable people in each city, and I would pick on certain vulnerable people to manipulate so as to get introductions to the people who were dealing heroin and crack in those city centres. And the reason I would particularly pick on vulnerable people is because, well, vulnerable people are the easiest to manipulate. Now, if that sounds ruthless, well, ruthlessness goes hand in hand with the punitive drug policy. As an undercover operative, I did what it took to get the results that I wanted. And so vulnerable people living homeless or in squats or on the edge of that kind of community, they knew the most dealers, and I could quickly work out who I could manipulate to introduce me further up the ladder so I could meet the people who were of greater interest to me. Now, one of the more notable operations I did in that style was in a town of Northampton. And I'd actually given up undercover work at the start of that. I was finding it too emotionally taxing. I was starting to feel guilty for the harm that I was causing people. In fact, one vulnerable person I'd manipulated had actually become suicidal when he found out that I wasn't his best friend. I was actually a cop. But I was persuaded to carry on and do this work because the gangsters who were running the supply in Northampton were a very infamous gang called the Burger Bar Boys. You can look them up. They're quite notorious, implicated in very famous murders, such as the murders of Letitia Shakespeare, Charmaine Harris in Birmingham, who were machine gunned. And anyway, they'd taken over the supply in Northampton. And I was enticed into that operation because this gang was using sexual violence as part of their reputation building. They were doing the normal kind of gangster stuff like kidnappings and maimings and all of that kind of thing. But they were also using gang rape as just part of their intimidation of the community in which they operated. So I spent 7 months infiltrating that gang. I went shoplifting with some of the street people, and I spent a lot of time with them, learning about people's lives, all the better to manipulate them. And nowadays I look back on that and refer to it as weaponizing empathy, because I used my ability to get to know those people to manipulate them more successfully. I almost got myself killed on at least 2 occasions on that operation. I was stripped at gunpoint at one point, and that gang were genuinely terrifying people. They were really, really unpleasant. Eventually, after 7 months, I had gathered evidence against the six main gang members who were controlling the supply in that town. But I'd also gathered evidence against 90 other people. And I knew from my investigation that there was no one else to meet. There was no one else to get introduced to. There were no new phone numbers to get. I'd caught everybody. And so I was in great anticipation of the conclusion of this operation, because I was thinking, wow, if I'm going to make a real difference here, we're catching effort in the trade, every sex worker runner, every person who was stashing money or whatever role it was, everybody was going to get caught. And so there were police from 5 different counties brought in for this enormous operation. And after the dust had settled, the intelligence officer, who was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground to hear about what the impact was afterwards, spoke to me. And he says, yep, we managed to interrupt the drug supply for a full 2 hours. 2 hours. 7 months of work, almost getting myself killed, 96 people arrested, hundreds of police involved, an absolute fortune it cost for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours. Now, I did that work for a long time, and I investigated organised crime for the rest of my career. And it took a long time for the penny to drop for me to understand. I was a bit slow. But that cannot be considered a success. It can be considered a complete waste of resources, but it's much, much worse than that, because I can't say for certain that the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, were the people who took up that opportunity and filled that gap in the market. But you can sort of picture the scene, can't you? A rival gang sat around and they hear the news of what the police have done for them, and they start cheering. One of them says, put the call in, boys. We're going to make a fortune. Because that's what the police do every single time they have a success. And I use the word success in very loose terms. And it's replicated exactly the same at every level in the market, from street level to regional wholesale level, national level, or international cartel level. Wherever there is a gang arrested, wherever there is a kingpin brought down, wherever there is a seizure, the biggest seizure ever, or certainly like the biggest seizure since the last one, wherever these things happen, an opportunity is created, and someone always takes up that opportunity. Because police, both nationally or internationally, are really, really good at catching drug dealers. If you give the police twice the resources, they will catch twice as many drug dealers. But that is part of the problem. It's key to the problem, because police activity just superheats the marketplace. The freelancer effect, wherever there is a gap created, means that there is conflict created to compete for that incredibly lucrative share of that market. Violence is created by the activity of police. Now, the general public believe that the current punitive policy of drugs policing makes them safer. And why is that? And if there are any police listening to this, please, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You can relate to this perfectly. I know that because you read your own intelligence systems. You know this. Courage is in being honest with yourself and the public about the reality of drugs policing. But wherever that gap is created, violence goes up. But the trouble is the public don't generally know this. And why is that? It's because the police control the narrative. Now, if international drug prohibition was a business, it would have the greatest, most powerful marketing strategy in the history of business, because police in every single nation on earth uses 3 principal images to market what they do, to tell everybody that what they're doing is successful. And those images are the picture of people's doors being smashed in the morning. In the UK, it's usually with a big red battering ram. You've all seen the pictures on the news or the newspapers. The second image is the row of the mugshots all lined up on the front page of a newspaper. We've all seen those images on the news or the newspapers. Anywhere, wherever you are in the world, you have seen these images. And of course, the most important image, the image of the huge seizure, the huge block of cocaine that looks like a hay bale, the multiple lumps of kilos of heroin all lined up with the cops behind them and the photographs being taken of it. We've all seen these images repeated time and time again, every single nation on earth. But these images are being presented and the public is made to believe that this is evidence of success. But it's not, because none of this police activity has reduced crime. And if you're a police officer listening to this, you can't present me with any evidence at all that you've reduced crime through drugs policing. But I can present you with plenty of evidence that crime has gone up. And if you're honest, you'll have seen in your own police intelligence that crime has gone up, violent crime has increased. Now, in the last 40 seconds, I'll just make this quick point. I represent police all over the world, and I speak to police all over the world. And there are 2 nations which cause me some consternation that I think are very important for the future of drug policy reform, even more than other individual parts of the world. One is South Africa, because apartheid is maintained by drug policy, because the inequalities are still there. The 10% of white people are not persecuted for drug offences, and black people are. Those inequalities are kept in place by drug policy. And another place is Northern Ireland, because as Chris referred to, you had the Troubles. Now, please, people from Northern Ireland, please forgive me, an English person commenting on the politics of Northern Ireland. But I do follow close, I do speak to police officers. I am aware of the intelligence. And Northern Ireland is quite peculiar in that organised crime has such a close link to the former paramilitary organisations. So what I'm saying to you, Northern Ireland, is from an outsider looking in, punitive drug policy, a current policy of prohibition, is an extension of the Troubles, because it's what's empowering the paramilitaries to keep their power that they've developed over these decades. So why would you not want to abolish what gives them the power? So thank you very much for listening.
No, Neil, thank you very much for ending on that note, and we forgive you for being an Englishman who's commenting on the Troubles, because that's exactly what we needed you to say. So Jane, we'll move on to you now, if you don't mind.
Oh, thank you so much, all, for organising tonight, and to all of the panellists. I'm really excited to have this webinar in Northern Ireland and to have so many brilliant new activists coming together to start something. I know Neil and I, and probably Peter, are very excited to come over, hopefully in the autumn, to launch this in person when we're able to. So as I was introduced, I work for Transform Drug Policy Foundation, a think tank that has been working on the issues of the need for drug policy reform for some 25 years. And I'll start by just talking a little bit about our work, and then why we formed Anyone's Child, and then just to finish on how you can get involved as audience members. So our drug policy, or the Misuse of Drugs Act, turns 50 this year. As the speakers have alluded to, our drug policies go back a little further. But what we can see is it has been an epic and catastrophic failure by a huge number of indicators. We've got drug deaths at record levels. We're criminalising thousands of people every year for non-violent drug offences. Our prisons are overflowing. Organised crime is thriving. Drug use exists in every village, town and city across the UK. And we're spending huge amounts of money trying to enforce this. The impact of all of this is felt most by the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. You can look at it, and there are many parallels with the perhaps more known about example of alcohol prohibition in 1930s America. We're witnessing so many parallels in what occurs, the rise of moonshine. You've got the rise of the criminal gangs, Al Capone, etc. This is what we've done with drugs. And I think the time has come that we need to accept that prohibiting drugs and punishing people for using them isn't working. It's never worked, and it's never going to work. So we've now got to look at alternatives. So let's start there. And at Transform, we've developed a vision of a post-prohibition world, and our document from 2009 called Blueprint for Regulation. It demonstrates them basically far from calling for a free-for-all for drugs. We're talking about a system of strict legal control and regulation. Ultimately, we're proposing a vision where doctors, pharmacists, licensed retailers get in control of the drug market, not organised criminals. We're proposing that the more strict regulation for those drugs associated with higher levels of harm, less strict for those that are less risky. We need to look at the evidence and the science to determine this. And I also think, and as Chris excellently spoke to, we need to learn some of the lessons from alcohol and tobacco to legal drugs, which are very risky, but we've learned a lot of lessons over the last few decades about how to better regulate these products. Let's take smoking, things like banning on smoking inside, health warnings on packaging, increasing age restrictions, stopping branding and advertising. These are the kinds of regulations that we're actually talking about when we're talking about regulating drugs. But the problem is that the area of drugs has been highly stigmatized, and moral judgments around drug use have come in the way of the evidence. And that's why we've set up Anyone's Child. Anyone's Child was formed 5 years ago. I received a call from the amazing campaigner, Anne-Marie Coburn, who just lost her 15-year-old daughter to an accidental MDMA overdose. And she called up and said, look, I need to form a campaign and add my voice to this. What can I do? And together we formed the Anyone's Child movement, which is now a movement of over 45 families in the UK. We've got partnerships in Mexico, Canada, Belgium and Kenya. And it's Transform's effort at a public-facing campaign. What we realise we need to do is to change hearts and minds around this important issue. All the families who are part of the Anyone's Child network lives have been destroyed by our current approach, and they're now all bravely speaking out, telling their lived experience of why they think that reform is needed. And this arose out of a recognition that evidence alone will not change policy. We've got stacks of it. But what we need to do is to start to look at some of the stigmas around this issue. We need to remove that othering. We need to encourage people to speak out about this suffering and how our drug laws are making it worse. As our families show, anyone can be impacted. And what we're showing is that contrary to popular belief, drug policy is harming our young people. It's not keeping them safe. And we've got to change this narrative. As I say, we've been growing over the past 5 years, and we've had some real successes. And the example I always go back to, because I think it demonstrates that we can win and change this, is that back in 2016, I was privileged to go to the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs. There's a unsexy title of an event. But anyway, nonetheless, it was the big United Nations meeting where all the international heads of nation were coming together to discuss drug policy at a major 10-year review. And I went there with an incredible mother from Canada. And she'd been doing a lot of lobbying work in advance of this meeting, meeting up with the health minister, with various officials. And on the morning that the Canadian government made the announcement that they were going to change Canada's drug policy, Donna, the mum I was actually in an Airbnb apartment with, got a phone call, and we were told to hurry into the UN. And we went there, and on the screen, the health minister, when she made her announcement, the health minister of Canada, Jane Philpott, she put a picture of this mother and her daughter. And she said, look, I've met with academics, I've met with policymakers, I've met with experts, with NGOs, but this mother has convinced me we must do better for the citizens of Canada. And that to me demonstrates that these stories can go to the heart of changing hearts and minds on this issue. And we need to keep telling these stories. Families are starting to change the debate in the UK too. We've got more and more politicians from across the political spectrum that are now willing to speak out on this and are calling for change. We're starting to see local innovation in the UK too, the extension of heroin-assisted treatment, the setup of diversion schemes, extension of safer drug testing facilities, and Peter has of course set up the first UK's overdose prevention centre, a much needed innovation. We're also witnessing more and more countries legalising cannabis. We've got more states in the US going, Canada, Uruguay, Mexico. Just today, I think New York and New Mexico states have passed initiatives to legalise recreational cannabis at the state level. We are in a crisis here in the UK. We are the drugs death capital of Europe. We need to change this and we need to catch up. We've also got initiatives increasingly experimenting with decriminalisation. Oregon very recently in the US has done that too. Change is possible, as I say, and I do think we need to catch up, but we also need your help. So I want to urge anyone listening that if you haven't already, please write to your MP. We'll send you a link after this call to our template letter. If you haven't told your MP that you support your reform, we need to demonstrate to our politicians that the public are switching on this issue and that more and more of us are calling for a change in drug policy. And they need to speak out on this and stop feeling comfortable in not speaking out. If you're based in Northern Ireland and interested in getting more involved with anyone's child on our activist network, please also let us know. And do complete the form that will come up on your screens at the end of this meeting so that we can stay in contact with you and update you on our campaign and ways to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was absolutely fantastic. We have a good few number of questions that have come in, so I'm just going to move on. Sort of Penny and Peter, I'll maybe throw this first one out to you because it's just sort of in terms of like mums or people who are currently in the middle of, a substance use issue. What would be your main advice to somebody at the minute who's just totally taken over by the fear of intoxication, whether it's themselves that need help or whether they're a parent who's looking at their child to go through it? I'm maybe saying that to you first, Penny.
This is a really hard one because this was one of the issues. Where do you turn to get help and advice? Although this is now nearly 8 years on, I know most parents still felt exactly what I felt. What is it that you do? And I remember Aidan actually trying to contact Narcotics Anonymous to try and speak to someone. That doesn't run every day in Northern Ireland, so you literally don't have someone to speak to. What I would say, and I do say to parents that ask me at this point, I say you're the best person for them to listen to because you are their support. You're the person they probably had the most difficulty actually opening up to. So people say, what should I say? And I say, don't say anything. Just close your mouth and listen to what they have to say to you. I think now, there are other places. I suppose there still is. I know it's ridiculous. Your GP, but GPs can be very understanding as well. And sometimes that's all people need to be able to give voice to what they're feeling, and then that opens doors for them. I know it is difficult, even addiction, and it's very difficult to because there's such a pressure on it. You know, it's very difficult if you're in need at that moment in time. And I know that even from Aidan, that's the time you want to speak to someone. So I know it isn't much, but all I would say is if you're a parent and you're having that difficulty now, or let your child speak to you and tell them that they're supported no matter what. And that doesn't mean that you're saying stop taking heroin or stop taking coke or whatever it is. What you're saying is I'm here to support you, you know, so.
Absolutely. What's always stood out for me, Penny, in our conversations about you talking to Aidan was Aidan talking to you about prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And I've experienced this with some of the young people that I work with as well. And from my perspective and understanding the history of prohibition, what they're saying is actually on point. But because they're young people who are saying this and they're like, the just say no approach is being forced on them, they're almost made to feel like they're crazy, even though what they're saying is actually right and a lot more insightful than you'll hear maybe some adults or politicians talk about. So, Peter, I think that's why I was sort of trying to bring you in that question as well. Is that an experience you would have felt from, you know, when you needed help yourself, that people are almost crazy making in a way, that you're not being listened to, that your voice, people were telling you how you should be instead of listening to your voice and what your needs were?
I think that certainly, you know, from my experience, my own personal experiences, when I was looking for help, it was always an enforced type of help. You know, it was always you need to do this, you need to do that. And I think what Penny said is like hits the nail on the head. You know, it's about listening and it's about compassion and it's about understanding and meeting people where they're at and not expecting them to meet you where you're at. And I think that's still what we see all this time later. You know, I'm going back to my own problematic substance uses like 20 years ago now. But even now, like what I say to people that come to the overdose prevention service who are looking for help is that if they're not getting that, if they're not getting listened to by the person that is in the official service, they have to ask for somebody else. You know, they have to ask to see their care plan, because people don't even now realise that they can be involved. You know, the decisions are often being made. You know, it's as if people who have these drug dependency issues with substances, specifically like heroin and powder form cocaine, we see a lot of. It's as if we're unintelligent, you know, people, as if we don't have any. And Penny touched on that earlier as well, you know, about her son going to university and stuff. You know, like I think sometimes we get treated like we've not got brains in our heads. You know what I mean? Like pointed at, and you need to follow our guidelines, and you need to do this and that, and Ola, you said it as well, you know, that all links into an age-old narrative that drugs are bad, you know, everybody should get off drugs shouldn't be in our society, and if drugs are bad and you're taking drugs, therefore you're a bad person, you know, and I think still in services now in Scotland, certainly, we see people that have that perceptions in their heads. Dinosaurs in the services trying to work with people without compassion, you know, and I'll finish on this. I know there's probably loads of questions, but you know, we also see this core of people with lived experience who went to like a big house in the countryside 20 years ago, got off drugs, and their life's been fantastically, miraculously changed, who also feed into that narrative, you know what I mean? And it's like the only thing that's going to help is lived experience. Now, I was working with somebody who came to my service the other day who is a worker in the service. He's been working in these services from the 1980s, late 80s, and he's never had any lived experience, and he's the most kind, caring and compassionate person you'll ever meet, and he listens to people and he meets people where they're at, and he doesn't care that he's seen at my service, because he says that people will be talking about me in 10, 20 years time. I'm like, no, that's a load of rubbish, don't talk to me about that, just go and help other people.
Peter, as well, you rushed there, but I think I'm going to throw this one back to you. I think a lot of people get confused and they think total abstinence and harm reduction have to be at completely opposite ends, but you yourself are totally abstinent. So, and I think, you know, I never want people to think that we're looking back and telling people they were wrong. We're trying to say that you're misguided. Total abstinence was wrong because it was enforced on everybody, but that can still be a personal choice for the individual. And I think people tend to get mixed up in that quite a bit here. I think that also links into sort of a question that I just seen come through there. Sorry, 2 seconds. I don't know, whoever wants to pick up this one can. What would you say to concerned members of the community who, mainly by misinformation, cannot or will not see the difference between promoting drug use and trying to fight for drug reform? Anybody? So I think what they're saying is if people being wrote off by, because if we're trying to talk about the need for drug reform in our communities, and part of that is normalising drug use, if parents are being scared of that and thinking that's just normalising basically everybody to get high all the time.
I'll give you a quick answer to that. I mean, I would say to listen to some of the families involved with anyone's child. I know that for many of those families, that if drugs had never entered their lives, that, you know, that would have been desirable. However, I think a lot of families have been forced to accept that drug use does exist, and that is a uncomfortable for some people, but I think an important first point. Look, it does exist in our society, and what we're talking about is trying to find ways to make it safer. And if anyone is not trying to encourage use, it's these families. It's come out of experience, hard learning, really researching this issue and concluding that what we're doing simply isn't working, and therefore we have to find a way to make it safer. And I think, you know, it so isn't coming from a point of, look, let's everybody take drugs. It's coming from such a different direction, and I would urge them to listen to some of the family stories.
I'd also say that, you know, having a legal and regulated market of drugs does not mean that it's a drugs free for all, which it is in effect now, a drugs free for all, because there is no regulation of it except by some of the most unsavory characters we can probably think of. And so by not having a regulated drug market, for example, I've got 2 teenage kids, you know, and I've no desire to see them come to any form of drug related harm. But if they were to happen to use substances of whatever sort, I would far rather they use stuff which is at least a clean supply, and there's the opportunity for advice and support around that as well. I mean, one of the best things I think that's happened in recent years has been the We Are the Loop stuff, which probably don't have time to go into this evening, but I think that's been fascinating for the impact on young people, young drug users who are the kind of the free hedonistic age, you know, sort of 18 to 25 or so. And that has been a great asset.
Yeah, I brought this up recently in my hometown, is the One Pill Will Kill poster has ended up in the bus there. And my point for that was, we have to have a safe and clean supply and talk about this to keep the young people safe. I don't want to put young people in more danger. It's kind of like treating it like sex. They're in their experimental years, whether we like it or not, they're doing it anyway. We are now exposing them to organised crime gangs, dirty drugs, and making them use in, you know, unsafe places, where if we brought all this out into the open, we can communicate to them, you know, your brain's still developing, this is not ideal for you, but we understand that you're probably going to do it anyway. Here is how to keep yourself safe. But that the fear of intoxication, because the prohibition has been about for hundreds of years at this point, is so ingrained in society that does take time to overcome that, and I think it also takes a willingness for us to admit our mistakes in the past. We don't just have to double down and be like, oh, I didn't get this 5 years ago, so it's going to be embarrassing, because I've made mistakes in the past too. I've held anti-drug rallies, I've stigmatized people, so I think we all have to be willing at some point to say, yeah, we all had the wrong end of the stick here, but moving forward, this is all about keeping young people safe. Neil, I'm going to throw, I don't even know if it's a question or just a series of thoughts that I'm going to throw at you. I'm just thinking in terms of like the Spy Cops bill that was talked about recently, and how you talked about, you know, infiltrating these gangs. And I know the county lines model that's out at the minute, and, you know, it's really, really young children, 13, 14-year-olds, the Spy Kids the Spy Cops Bill at the other side was also trying to bring kids into that, to combat the kids that were maybe coming in from the drug dealing side. To me, all of this just seems like it's just the recipe for a lot of corruption. Then it's not getting better. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, no problem. There's a few things to unpick there. I mean, the best way, I think, to see this war on drugs is not as a war, but as an arms race. And you mentioned county lines, which you've got developing rapidly in Northern Ireland, like we've had for a few years in England. County lines is actually my fault. It's my fault, or it's people like me, because it's the perfect response to the kind of success that I had, the kind of tactics I did. And that's why gangs are now using children, because children are the perfect buffer zone between the police and the dealer. So this has not happened by accident. It's happened as a result of policy. It's happened as a result of policing. And one of the most important, well, it is the most important tool for policing drugs. And this is referring to the point you made when you first spoke, Peter. Yeah, police are constantly looking for information from people that they speak to. And they do get that from low-level people who use drugs. But people who are signed up as regular informants, they're referred to as CHIS, and they are the most important tool in the toolbox of policing drugs. Now, another one of the reasons why gangs are now using children is that children can't be infiltrated by normal CHIS, by adult CHIS. So the response from the state in this never-ending arms race is to now use children to actually infiltrate the gangs. So say a 15-year-old gets caught in Belfast with a load of heroin and crack, they're part of a county lines dealing, they're going to get arrested, and a source handler is going to speak to that child and say, look, your family's going to feel the pressure of this. If you speak to us, we can make things better for you. If you've got a court case coming up, we can get your sentence reduced. And suddenly that child is now a police spy, and that child will be put at risk by remaining in that gang and providing information to police. Now, many source handlers or senior police will deny that is the full extent of how that child will be used. But staying in contact with many source handlers and other serving police, and from my own experience, I'm sure that children will be put at risk in that way. And that will continue and that will increase, because there's no end to this war and there's no peace treaty. Now, you mentioned corruption. If you'll forgive me just to tag this little bit on, if I'm not taking up too much time. Another aspect which is very rarely spoken about is the corruption that's caused by current policy. Now, I referred to earlier on where police have success, one gang is arrested or one kingpin is arrested. But what happens often at the wholesale level is that wherever one gang is arrested, that means the gang that is most able to take up that new opportunity in the market is a gang that already has a presence in that market. So what they do is they expand their influence, the gang grows, which means that the people making the money in that market are suddenly making more money, which means they have more disposable income to invest in corruption. And again, this happens at every single level, street level, wholesale level, international level. Corruption is caused by the mechanism of policing, because monopolies are created. This is why there used to be 20 cartels in Mexico. Now there are only 3. And those 3 cartels literally have the international financial power to corrupt entire nation states. Just look at the corruption of West Africa. So the more we try hard, the more we create the situation where corruption increases. Now, I remember I spoke to in the parliament in Denmark once, and a senior police officer laughed at me scornfully. He says, no, we don't have that kind of corruption in Denmark. We're not as corrupt as the UK. But that's the kind of naivety which is so prevalent. And only a few weeks later, the head of the drug squad in Copenhagen was arrested for corruption. So it happens everywhere, and is happening more with every single day. And again, any police that listen to this, I'm speaking to you. Many of you will understand this very, very clearly. And the only way we can change this is if we bring the public alongside and make that social movement grow.
Absolutely. Just on the end of your comments there, Neil, we have a question that's come in here that says, On children caught up in the trade taken advantage of by both more senior drug dealers and the police, where can parents turn to for help?
Wow, that's a very difficult question. I mean, the point is, yes, they are being taken advantage of. And the important point to note here that we should never lose sight of is that these children are suffering real-time trauma because they are being blackmailed. They are often being blackmailed with sexualized images, which they're forced to take. There's all sorts of very, very nasty exploitation and traumatizing of children going on. And it is entirely the wrong approach for the government to allow the police to recruit those traumatized children as police spies. It should never be allowed. That's the first thing. But in terms of where people can turn to, well, that's a very difficult thing because different charities do different things in different areas. So I would refer you to whatever charities are putting their hands up in Northern Ireland. But often the problem with those charities is they don't quite understand, in my experience, they don't always understand the failures of policy. So that's something to bear in mind. But what I would also say is increasing numbers of parents of exploited children are finding at least some sense of support by contacting anyone's child, because anyone's child is about any family which is being traumatized by drug policy. So I would urge you to get in touch with Jane if you feel that that's the kind of support that you can be part of.
Absolutely, and I would totally agree with that. The first thing that came to mind was the Anna Liffey project, but that's in Dublin. I don't really know of anything up here. So if there is any families out there who just want somebody to talk to, please, by all means, just reach out and talk to us. The next question kind of follows on from this as well. And Chris, maybe you might pick up on this one, or anybody if you want to, but just quite a simple question. How do we go about changing drug education in schools in Northern Ireland?
I think you have to start with a very simple promise that we won't continue to lie to young people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I honestly believe that. I think that, this may offend some, but, the very safe talk to Frank stuff is disastrous. It seems to be such a good thing. And all it really does, in my opinion, is it keeps those who are already pretty safe from harm somehow safer. And it does absolutely nothing for those who are at risk of harm or being harmed already. So I think drugs education, especially for adolescents and schools, needs to take a very hard look at itself and be a lot more honest than my experience of it is. Now, I don't work with young people, so I don't know exactly what goes on nowadays in terms of schools and things, but my teenage kids have told me, that they've heard this and that and the other thing, and I'm going, it's interesting, and one I'm very proud of her because she has argued back actually and given some factual information to her peers and to her educators as well. So yeah, when it comes to drugs education, I really think that we need to really look at that, and we have to start off from the basis of we will be honest with you about these drugs and about the risks that there are, but also about the pleasures that there are.
Absolutely. And Penny, am I right in saying that you have went into schools and talked to some young people with anyone's child in the past?
I have indeed. And actually, see the story that I tell, that's a story that I've told in schools as well. And it's not, I never put it across. Aidan is not an example of what, going wrong. What Aidan is, it's basically to say to them exactly what I say here. My child is exactly the same as all of you. I also talk to the children about regulation, about heroin-assisted treatment, and about safe injection facilities. The message that I give is exactly the same. Particularly when I'm talking to young people, I'm talking to sixth formers, is your parents want to know if you have a problem. You can't. Aidan had said to me, I didn't tell you because I thought you wouldn't worry. So that's what I explained to them. Now, what I do is I always speak to the principal first, and I do say, I'm not going to say what you think I'm going to say, because I don't go over any of that stuff. I mean, I do say as a parent, I wish, of course, Aidan had never taken heroin. of course I wish that. But then I wish a lot of things, you know, that I think that your children can do that are dangerous. So yeah, and from the young people's point of view, I've had parents contact me via friends and whatnot and said that their son or daughter came home and like hugged them for the first time in ages, or said, "Mum, you know, want to talk to you about something." So it does make a difference. And say, but I think it is when people say, and I think anyone's child, all those parents and anyone's child talk about their children with such love. And I think that message goes across to young people. You are loved and you're valued, you know. And if a parent like me can understand it, your parents will understand it too.
It really is just about building that safe space. But I've had that a couple of times too. We come in and talk to the young people. They have to know they just can't take drugs. I was like, oh, I'm not your girl for that conversation. The next question that I have, I'm going to throw out: is there a legal drugs policy that we all agree on? Portugal, is that? I would say Portugal decriminalisation model is a great place to start. If it's only a halfway house, I think we have to go but we have to work towards legalisation, because if we just stay with decrim, the black market's still there. The organised crime gangs are still making money, and so the actual root cause of the problem has not been took away.
But when you look at what it was designed to achieve, it has done that, and some as well. So it may only be a halfway house, but in terms of, you know, HIV infections and drug overdoses and all sorts of other issues, those things have largely disappeared, and it's fantastic that that's been the case.
Oh yeah.
So even just by decriminalisation, to the extent to which they have done, they've managed to achieve those amazing effects, which, you know, we should all be very jealous of.
And I would totally agree, Chris, and say that is absolutely something that I think we'd all agree on. I think when you look at the issue internationally, though, and the issues of Mexico, of Colombia, you know, really on that international picture, we really have to conclude that regulating drugs market is the long-term route for drug policy, because it is about getting those criminal supply chains from the source. We need to regulate the whole shebang. Or you end up with an unregulated supply, as you have in Portugal, or if you look at the Dutch model for cannabis, they have what's known as the backdoor problem. I think you can, you know, and that is why you have to have the whole lot up and out in the open and a regulated supply, which the government have control over. And that is how we really can make this market safer. We can put age controls on, we can put health and safety information on packets, we can give honest and open advice about how people should be taking these products. And whilst I recognise that's not going to happen tomorrow, I think that's the direction in which we need to be travelling in.
I think the easiest first step for regulation is the control of heroin. It's the British system. It's the way we used to do it. You know, if someone used to have a problem with heroin or cocaine, they would go to their doctor and be supplied and be given a clean supply. Nothing could be simpler than that, and we don't even need a change in legislation for it. They've been doing that in Switzerland since 1994, and Switzerland used British evidence to inform their policy at a time when we went drastically the wrong way. And as a result of their policy in Switzerland, their drug deaths dropped dramatically, very dramatically. Their crime is reduced by 50%. They have virtually eliminated street sex work. This very, very clear example of how the simplest form of regulation can save lives and improve society there in Switzerland.
Thanks very much, guys.
Can I just quickly say as well? I mean, I completely agree with the move towards, you know, a completely regulated market where we, you know, regulate the whole market from supply right down. My only concern is that we are still so far away from that, and publicly people are still so bought into the narrative of the Misuse of Drugs Act and what's been going on. If we go too far with that publicly at the moment, I think if we're more a collective voice towards decriminalisation and get that in place first, and then we as a collective voice move from decriminalisation to full-scale regulation. Because I think now if you talk about regulation, especially when it comes to things like stimulants, I mean, I love Transform's book, Stimulants and How to Regulate Them, but if you talk to the general member of the public about that, they're like, what, you're going to go into the pub and get a line of cocaine on the bar? Because there's no real understanding of it, and I think people just get scared of that.
Yeah, I do definitely think it's so much of this comes down to just empowering communities with education and individuals. I have another question that's come in here that kind of maybe links to the complexity of the conversation. What do you say to prohibitionists who fret that unethical predatory corporations like Big Tobacco will take over the industry? I think this is a great question, and it sort of plays into a lot of what Carhart says. So
shall I try that one?
Yep.
What I have really enjoyed of the last few years is the fact we have shifted from should we or shouldn't we do regulation into the realm of how we should do it. And I've taken part in some events, I'm sure Jane has as well, where there has been the more laissez-faire argument, the sort of Institute for Economic Affairs wanting to open up the markets, and opposing that the more transformed, perhaps more sensible approach of having a public health approach and controlling these products. Now, yes, there are people who say no, we shouldn't do this because it would be handing great markets to big pharma. Now, let me tell you all, from a policing point of view, I would rather have the most extreme, scary capitalist model with big pharma dominating the world than the current power of organised crime. And don't get me wrong, I advocate for a very careful public health-based model, but where people cite that as a risk, those people do not understand the current situation, the catastrophe of the current power of organised crime.
Yeah, 100%. And I myself would be a massive socialist, but I've said this to people recently. We aren't stopping corporate cannabis getting in here. If big tobacco and big alcohol take over, that is an issue of capitalism. That's not a drug issue, and that's a completely and utterly different conversation. But there is a number of voices in the island of Ireland at the minute who would be very much pushing this, that big alcohol, big tobacco, big pharma is going to take over, and it's just so distracting in the conversation. Last question.
I think final thought on that is that I know that Transform has some concerns around corporate capture, in particular around the cannabis market. And I think that is a real concern, but I suppose that's where we're at a unique opportunity in policy making. Our policies going forward are not determined, and I suppose that is for us as activists to start to try and determine that and to fight back on some of that, to learn some of the lessons. There is not one model for cannabis legalization operating around the world. There are numerous models now to look at, from Uruguay, which has a government monopoly over the supply of cannabis, to a much, much more capitalist model that's running in Canada and in some US states. We need to start looking at that evidence too. I have great concerns about corporate capture of the market, although I would agree with Neil's point that even that would be a better scenario than what we have now. I totally take that, but let's learn some of that. Let's try and do smart regulation and start putting things like social justice at the heart of drug policy. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity for us as activists.
Yeah, Jane, I love your point about learning from different places as well. Like the success of the temperance and prohibition movement in Ireland came from the fact that we looked at what was happening in England, Scotland, Wales, America. We took the strengths and weaknesses of other movement and then we incorporate it for our own specific needs here. And that's exactly what we have to do. We can't, just implement Canada's model here or Portugal's model. We need their models, but we need to make it work for our needs here. And as I say, we done it before. We done it really successfully. I think I mentioned in the email to you guys that the temperance reformers said that their success was from a blending of the shamrock rose and the thistle. But I think our blending of the shamrock rose and thistle tonight is going to get more social justice and social reform. And I was going to ask another question, but our time is nearly up. So I think I will end it there for tonight, guys, and just say thank you so much for everybody for coming along. This was intended to be more of an information dump tonight rather than a debate. The other side of this conversation has in Northern Ireland kind of has a free-for-all. So I just wanted to pull together the families, the services, the amazing community activists like Peter, police like Neil and Jean from Anyone's Child, to show everybody what's already happening. And we're going to be following up, hopefully when restrictions lift, with an in-person event in Northern Ireland. And we would really love to increase the number of activists that we have here, to do stalls at the week, information stalls in Ballymena, Ballycastle, Derry, wherever we're needed in Northern Ireland. As I say, we have an election coming up early at the start of next year, and our politicians need to be held to account. The wall of silence needs to be smashed, and we need to start implementing the evidence-based reforms. Before we go, did anybody have anything they want to say before we head off? No? Okay then, well that's everybody for tonight, and thanks so much everybody, and I hope to see you all soon.